One. Up to 6 minutes, please, Ms Regan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to move the Alba Party amendment to this motion today. So the fiscal framework, as we've been discussing, is complicated, but I believe it's deliberately complicated. It's the formula, obviously, for determining Scotland's funding as part of the UK via the block grant, the Barnett formula, minus the abatements or deductions. Scotland is rewarded if we can grow our economy faster than the UK, and then punished if we don't. But no region of the UK, other than London and the South East, ever ends up with higher GDP rises than the UK average. So the additional clause was added to the Smith Commission report, the no detriment clause, which we've been discussing already this afternoon. And this was meant to recognise the fact that, for the most part, Scotland's economic performance has a lot more to do with reserved UK economic policy than it does with anything that we do here at Holyrood. And of course, we recently witnessed firsthand, during the time of the pandemic, why we need that full fiscal autonomy, because much of the financial support that the Scottish Government could provide to back up the public health policy could only be delivered if the UK Government decided that those were also the priorities in England. So, in my opinion, the no detriment provisions do not deliver as perhaps they might do for Scotland. And rather than the Smith Commission delivering greater fiscal control and responsibility for Scotland, it has unfortunately left us with a position of having greater accountability, but crucially without the fiscal levers to back it up. Greater responsibility without power. Never a good position to be in. In recent years, the Scottish Government has chosen to increase tax slightly, and this should mean more money raised to spend on investing in better public services, something I think we would all welcome, and I'm sure the Scottish public would welcome very much. But this is not what happened. The Spice report, the Scottish public paid £900 million in higher tax over a 3-year period, but the Scottish budget only rose by £170 million over that same period. So £730 million was lost because of the fiscal settlement. And that would be enough, of course, to raise the Scottish child payment to £40 a week several times over. So Scotland is in the unfortunate position of raising tax in order to fill a black hole in the block grant created by the fiscal framework. I'll give way.
Michael Mara.
I wonder if the member could tell us, when she was a minister in the government, whether she expressed any scepticism to her colleagues as to whether those tax positions were the right approach to take, given the consequences.
Ashri.
The member may not remember this, but I was actually in the Justice Department, and I certainly did have conversations with colleagues, but particularly about funding settlements for justice. I wasn't obviously responsible for financial decisions made on a broader scale than that. My opinion is that this is not a good deal for Scotland, and the new fiscal framework is worse still. I believe it's a trap. I think it's an economic trap. I think it's a political trap that the Scottish Government have acceded to either knowingly or unknowingly. The fiscal framework is, of course, a means of forcing the Scottish Government to pursue a low-tax, small-state approach to government, and this is against the values of the Scottish Government and, of course, the majority of Scots who elected that government. And also, it also has the real danger of relative economic decline built into it as well. Now, separating what economic impacts come from UK policy and what are actually from policy created in this Parliament is almost now an impossible task, which has been alluded to earlier in the debate. But this new deal seems to have accepted that it is just too difficult. And so, as a result, Scotland just accepts that it's going to be responsible for both. Disastrous economic choices that are made in London are heaping misery onto a Scotland that is in a position of just running to stand still against things like soaring inflation and Brexit carnage. Dr Jim Cuthbert, formerly of the Scottish Office, explains that it's nigh on impossible for the Scottish Government to develop a successful fiscal policy under this arrangement. So it's very easy to see why the Conservatives are happy with this settlement. I don't think they should be, by the way. I think it harms their constituents as much as it harms my constituents. But what's less easy to understand is why the Scottish Government has agreed to it. Is it really in the best interests of Scotland, or is it, in fact, damaging? One reason that I believe it is damaging is it is forcing Scotland into suboptimal decisions on capital spending. This is just one example. And this would be the poor value PPP, which is a model of financing public sector infrastructure that the UK has now moved away from because they can. But Scotland can't, because our choices are very limited. I'm concluding now, I'm afraid. Presiding Officer, it's only clear that devolution can only deliver to us so much. And it is the powers of independence that will enable Scotland to create a thriving economy, a wealthier nation, and higher living standards for all of us. Thank you, Presiding Officer. In my opening remarks, I set out my conceptualisation of responsibility without power being a very dismal situation to find yourself in. And my motion, I know, speaks about VAT, so I want to just take a little bit of time just to talk that over, because I think it also goes some way to reinforcing that conceptualisation. So the Scotland Act of 2016 states that receipts from the first 10 pence of standard rate of VAT and the first 2.5 pence of reduced rate of VAT in Scotland would be assigned to the Scottish Government's budget. So VAT would be the second largest source of tax revenue for the Scottish Government after income tax. But despite this, the new framework has not managed to navigate a path in order to deliver it. And of course, the Presiding Officer, the key word above there is assigned. I'll give way.
Liz Smith.
I'm very grateful to Ash Regan giving way. Is she aware of the fact that when the current Finance Committee took evidence about this VAT assignment, and also when our predecessor committee, the Finance and Constitution Committee, took evidence, I'm afraid there was unanimity that it was far too difficult and complex to actually make that assignment?
Ash Regan.
I do understand that, but I think there's a metaphor there, really, isn't there, for the fiscal framework as a whole, that it's complicated, it's difficult to get this to work in Scotland's favour. And I think we've heard that across the chamber today. So VAT being assigned rather than devolved means that even if the promises of the Smith Commission were delivered, the Scottish Government would not have any direct policy control over VAT. And if the framework did allow for VAT to come to the Scottish budget as it's supposed to do, that VAT will continue to be collected by HMRC at the UK level, and the amount of tax assigned to Scotland would require to be estimated using a model developed by HMRC, the Treasury and the Scottish Government, which makes the point that the member has just raised about the complexity of it. But the VAT assignment, a further 15% of Scottish budget, would be based on VAT revenues raised in Scotland. But I think we need to think about this. That would be 15% of the entire Scottish budget, but no control. That's the key point here. No control for the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government, as to what VAT should be set at. So I do think this goes some way to illustrating the difficulty for Scotland in this framework, whether it's the previous framework or the revised one. So I remember, it's some time ago now, when I was on the Finance and Constitution Committee, as it used to be called, back in 2016, and I listened to presentations where they were setting out, from experts, setting out the previous fiscal framework at that time. And I understood the way it was constructed made it extremely difficult, if not even impossible, for Scotland to succeed under that framework. And I'm afraid that nothing I have heard since then, and nothing that I have heard today, has convinced me otherwise on that point. But I just want to take a little bit of time now to talk about the debates that we've taken part in this afternoon. So, Michael Mara, generally, I think, a fairly dispiriting speech. However, he did make some interesting and, I think, important remarks around the issues of timing, around secrecy and scrutiny on the review process itself. And I think that considering how important, I know we've said this afternoon this is probably quite a dry subject, but it's very, very important to Scotland. I think there should be potentially more involvement for the public, more involvement for parliamentary committees and experts. And that was picked up as well by Kenny Gibson. He spoke particularly about more involvement for the Scottish Parliament, and I'm sure for the committee that he is involved in. Michelle Thompson echoed my own comments, I think, when she spoke about PPP and the very, very poor value that it represents to the public purse, and how, whilst the UK has now been able to, it's in this privileged position where it can now move away from this model of funding public infrastructure, whilst Scotland is not in such a privileged position, and the fiscal framework is locking Scotland into its use. And I think that should be of interest to everybody in this chamber. Ivan McKee spoke about Jim Cuthbert, and he used the quote that tax cuts are the only way to grow the economy, and he admitted he wasn't sure if that was the point that Mr Cuthbert was going for. I don't believe that is what he was saying. I think what Mr Cuthbert is reflecting there is, in that comment, was in fact the Treasury view. The Treasury view, of course, being that the only way that Scotland could minimise economic harm to itself via the fiscal framework is to accept that economic straitjacket that the Conservatives would propose to Scotland. Now, Presiding Officer, in my earlier remarks, I focused on what my view is that in comparison to the full flexibility that we might have and the full fiscal autonomy would give to Scotland, that this new fiscal framework, this review, is in fact a bad deal for Scotland. And no amount of tinkering around the edges will suffice to change my view on that. And I'm sure the Scottish Government benches will agree with me that only with the powers of independence can Scotland truly flourish and grow, and only with economic separation from Westminster can we ensure that our policy priorities, those of the Scottish people, are matched by the fiscal levers of the Scottish Government. But we can, of course, only have those levers, and Scotland can only have that power by becoming an independent country.
Thank you, Ms Regan.